Since the US election is coming up rather shortly and all people talk about nowadays is mail voting, I would like to remove your attention slightly from it, assuming you had enough of it, and instead redirect it towards voter IDs that time to time pop up in the political discussion. The modern discourses surrounding voter IDs are, however, aimed at labeling them as racist or ineffective. And that is precisely what this video is going to be about. I'm going to analyze a few arguments that are often repeated by the opponents of voter IDs, and I will debunk them, as well as I would provide some of my own personal wishes on what to do next so that we can have better election outcomes. So without further ado, enjoy my video. Argument number 1. Voter fraud is not significant, so we should not worry about it. And I'm willing to concede that you're right. Voter fraud, although exists, is not a major problem currently. Although that is not to say that voter ID would help to reduce voter fraud even further. However, this is not the main aim behind people who would support voter IDs. The purpose of voter IDs is to raise confidence in the voting system so that we don't have to worry about possibly 2 million dead people voting in our elections. As it is estimated by Pew Research, almost 24 million active voter registrations in the United States are either invalid or inaccurate. Moreover, 12 million voter records were riddled with incorrect addresses or other errors. That is to say that statistics like that decrease the confidence of most Americans in their democracy, making them suspicious whether to vote or not, thus diminishing their chances in voting because of the perception of a possible gerrymandering, if you will. With voter IDs, however, you could not only solve that problem, but also the problem of a voter fraud that, although is very minimal now, it can be substantial in the future. Building on that, United States is not the only country that has voter IDs to protect its democracy. Many other democratic countries also happen to have it. Such countries include Norway, the UK, Germany, Switzerland, France, Mexico, Ireland, and many other countries to another degree. Argument number 2. Not everyone has time to get a voter ID, and some people don't even have enough money for it. Well, it can be certainly frustrating to spend a few hours of your time so that you can get a voter ID and then wait for it to arrive by mail. While in some states it won't even be free, as the argument 2 would say. But if you have noticed, this objection could be raised about literally everything that is related to government bureaucracy. It's the same with getting a driver's license, healthcare, or some other means of identification. I agree that it should not take as much time as it does now, and I would further say that all those IDs should be free for one to acquire, but you cannot ignore the double standards at play when people accuse voter IDs of that and not other IDs that are also, surprise surprise, are actually harder to get. Now, those were the only arguments that I heard that were not about race. 2 of the following arguments will be strictly about race, so brace yourselves. Argument number 3. America has historically suppressed the votes of people of color, and this is just another example of that. While it is true that many state organs like the police in the United States, as well as basic laws with regards to voting, were designed in such a way as to discourage the participation of blacks in the public and political life. However, it does not mean that even though some countries started off as an X, it is still an X in the present time. My country, Russia, for example, just in the past 120 years, changed from a Tsarist empire to a semi-constitutional monarchy, then to a liberal republic, then to a Soviet republic, then to a Soviet dictatorship, then they had perestroika, and then you know what happened next. The same can be said about the voting in America. As voting was once designed for white Protestant males owning a significant property, it is now universal for everyone above the age of 18, with maybe restrictions placed on some felons in some states. Volkswagen, for example, started off as a Nazi company. Does it share the Nazi characteristics now? I don't think so. And the same I will say with regards to voter IDs, that, spoiler alert, didn't even actually start to keep the black man down. And if you disagree with me, please show me how they continuously helped to suppress the black vote. The only thing I found was quite the opposite. That is, black voter turnouts in 2012 exceeded the rate of white voter turnout even in the states with the strictest voter ID laws. You might object and say that not all IDs are accepted when making a voter ID and disproportionately it affects a certain group of people, and that is the argument I often hear, but then nobody is stopping them from getting a right type of a voter ID if they truly want to vote. Rules are the same for everybody. Argument number 4. Voter IDs are racist because 92% of white Americans have voter IDs, while only 75% of blacks have voter IDs. This is in a way similar to the previous talking point and basically implies racism when there are unequal outcomes. Unfortunately, in this day and age, unequal outcomes automatically mean racism, and I have the displeasure to prove them wrong. Well, it is true that there are inequalities of outcomes in voter IDs, just like in any other social sphere. Still, it's more of an indication of a devil-may-care attitude towards participating in an election than anything else. You see, along with blacks, there are also Asians, with 20% of them having an invalid voter ID. Is the system rigged against them too? Even though they outperform whites on almost all virtual parameters of performance, while also being the most affluent race in America, which makes it easier for them to acquire a voter ID if they really want it. How about 80% of seniors who are mostly white and also the wealthiest age group in America? Do we also systematically target them too in a way so that they are not able to vote? Or is it just they don't want to vote? The same can be said about those who are 18 to 24. They just don't want to partake in an election. Unequal outcomes are not made because of discrimination, at least in the United States, but rather because of different attitudes that people have in regards to putting in an effort. Some people just don't want to vote, and I'm putting money on it that those are over 90% of people who lack a voter ID. But you might say, Ubersoy, what if there is a person who wants to vote, but because of voter IDs they are discouraged from voting? Then I would ask you the following question. Does the person really wants to vote when they can't even get a voter ID, which is even free in some states, while in others it would cost one about $100? And you can apply this logic to other things. If a person doesn't want to drive, they will not acquire a driver's license, and moreover, you should be thankful that voting is not compulsory in the United States like it is in many countries, which is to say you have a freedom to abstain from voting, and that is rather a good thing because it removes people from voting who don't have the passion in politics and are uneducated in the matter. And since we are now talking about the uneducated and passive voters, it is time for the final part of this video. But before that, here's my another argument for why voter IDs are not racist. That is their universal support among whites and among non-whites, 81% and 77% of support respectively, showing a little difference in opinion. Liberal democratic systems of voting imply an equality between different types of voters. It's no matter who you are, a professor in political science, a rapper, a stripper, or an actor, all of those groups' vote is equal under the law, although they have a difference in levels of knowledge about politics that they possess. Unfortunately, in a liberal democracy, a person who is trying to run for office tries to appeal to as many people as they can, so that they can get elected. And because of that, what happens in practice is we get a president whose platform is the lowest common denominator platform of the base that elected them. On practice, we don't get a president or a government that would do something extraordinary, like restructuring the immigration or the taxation system, or introducing something brand new into the discourse, or even, God forbid, interfering into education system or big businesses to ensure political diversity. Instead, we get a centrist president and a government that would do stuff that a majority of their base and country would allow them to do, therefore stopping most of positive reforms from happening, slowing down the process. And a lot of people in the country don't really think of anything big besides themselves, but what is most interesting is that almost always the president shares most of the core beliefs of their voters, which is to say that a president is the reflection of their voter base. that is assuming their approval rate among their voter base is pretty high, like Trump's among the Republicans. That relationship between the base and the leader can be mutual, but in most circumstances the leader comes out of their base. Where am I getting at, you may ask? Particularly to Socratic criticism of democracy, where uneducated people vote and choose popular leaders who appeal to them the most. At some point of time, we have to deal with uneducated people if we truly want our system to be effective, unless you believe that their voices are equal, just like the knowledge and the expertise in medicine of a medical doctor and a homeopathic doctor or a witch. If so, then you might as well close this video and not listen to what I have to say next. And if you're still here, how about this solution? Voting as a privilege. Although voter IDs are most certainly not discriminatory in nature, studies that I looked at differ with their conclusions of what an effect it has on voter turnout. Most studies, however, agree that with strict voter IDs, voter turnout drops by about a few percent points. And before you jump at me with haha gotcha remarks, I will say that it was an expected result, as I was surprised actually that it doesn't even work properly in some places, since one study actually reported an increase in voter turnout, but for other cases voter turnout has decreased for the most part because lazy people who would not bother to get a voter ID are not voting. But that's rather a good thing, since they don't take politics seriously enough and moreover are more likely to be not educated, because being uneducated has a very strong correlation with absence from voting. Still, voter IDs are not a good tool to keep the passive and the uneducated away. Maximum what it does is it decreases their vote by about 2 to 3%. What a liberal democracy should rather do is asking people common sense questions before voting. Let's imagine there is a voting day, but before one casts a ballot, they have to answer the following 10 questions. 6 questions could be about policy of each of the candidates, and 4 other questions could be a common sense questions about politics, economics, or something along those lines. And if the person gets at least 7 of them correct, then they may have the privilege of voting. Or we could do it more complicated, by doing exams just like in driving school, where a year before every election there will be a voluntary testing, and if the person would pass the exam, they may have the voting license. That of course has to get renewed every 2 to 3 elections. There are many ways of determining the eligibility of voters, whether by the IQ test, a knowledge test, getting a voter's license. What should matter the most is not allowing dumb people to make decisions for the rest of us. That way we may remove the problem of passive and uneducated voting, and the politicians would not have to appeal to the lowest common denominator of their base and even appear from their base themselves anymore. It might of course create some resentment, but as long as nobody is deprived from their voting because of their immutable characteristics, and we look at voting as a privilege and not a right, everything should be fine, and not only the confidence in a liberal democracy would grow substantially, but also the overall levels of education and performance of society will increase. Ideally, those who are not indifferent to the fate of their country would compete with others in knowledge, thereby increasing the overall levels of education, while those who are not passionate enough to learn in order to participate in a democracy would not bother the rest by deteriorating the performance levels of that given society. Anyways, that was all for today. If you enjoyed my video, please leave a like and subscribe for more, and comment what you think about my proposal to battle passive and educated voters. Maybe you agree with me, maybe you have a recommendation of your own, maybe you think that we shouldn't battle them at all, because you think that literally everyone should participate in a democracy, and that there are no fundamental distinctions between a voter value of a person who spends 10 hours of their week learning about politics and a person who gets their opinions from friends and watching television and also is apolitical, but when the election comes, both of those people would cast a ballot.